My name is Joaquin Ramirez, and I'm a fish farmer who survived the first 3 weeks of the zombie outbreak. When contaminated water turned my neighbors into mindless killers, my obsession with water purity became the only thing keeping me alive. I watched my town fall, lost people I cared about, and discovered that my aquaculture knowledge might be humanity's last hope against an infection that spreads with every bite. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Joaquin Ramirez, and I'm writing this exactly 3 weeks after the world ended. Not with bombs or earthquakes or some alien invasion like you see in the movies. The world ended with a sip of water on a Tuesday morning in Crescent City, California, and I'm one of the few people left who remembers what normal felt like. I run a salmon farm here on the coast, or I used to run one before everything went to hell. Spent the last 8 years building it from nothing into something I was actually proud of. Sustainable aquaculture, closed-loop water systems, the whole 9 yards. My ex-wife Sarah used to joke that I cared more about water quality than most people care about their kids. She wasn't entirely wrong. I test everything twice, trust nothing that comes out of a tap without running it through my own filters first. Sarah always said my paranoia about water contamination would drive me crazy someday. Turns out it's what kept me sane. October 15th started like any other Tuesday. I was up at 5:30 checking the overnight readings on Tank C, our biggest salmon enclosure. The fish had been acting strange for about a week, more agitated than usual, but the water chemistry looked perfect. Temperature holding steady at 58 degrees. pH balanced at 7.2, dissolved oxygen levels right where they should be. I remember thinking that if the fish were stressed, it had to be something environmental I wasn't measuring yet. I had 2 employees helping me run the operation. Maria Santos, 26 years old, been with me for 3 years. Best eye for fish health I've ever seen. Could spot a sick salmon from 50 feet away just by watching how it moved in the water. Then there was Jake Morrison, older guy, maybe 55, former commercial fisherman who'd lost his boat to bankruptcy. Jake knew these waters better than anyone and could fix any piece of equipment with nothing but duct tape and determination. That morning, Maria was checking the filtration systems while Jake was down at the dock inspecting the aerators. Normal routine. I was in the main office building logging water temperature readings when my phone started buzzing with an emergency alert. 9:47 a.m. exactly, because I was writing the time in my log when it came through. The message was simple at first. Boil water advisory, Crescent City Water District. Do not drink tap water, potential contamination detected. Boil all water for consumption, more information to follow. I called Maria on the radio. You drinking any tap water this morning? No, she said. Same as always, brought my water bottle from home. Why? Emergency alert just came through. Something about contamination in the city water. Jake's voice crackled over the radio from the dock. That explains why the harbor master looked like he was having the worst hangover of his life this morning. Thought he was going to puke all over his own shoes. I should mention something about our setup here. We're about 2 miles north of downtown Crescent City, right on the coast. The farm sits on 12 acres of what used to be salt marsh before the previous owner filled it in. We've got 6 main holding tanks, a processing facility, and the office building where I spend most of my time. The whole operation runs on a combination of fresh water from our own well and treated seawater from the Pacific. Everything gets filtered through our closed-loop system before it touches the fish. The thing about running an aquaculture operation is that you become obsessed with water quality. One bad batch of water can kill thousands of fish and wipe out years of work in a matter of days. So I test everything. Well water, seawater, treated water, pond water. I've got more testing equipment than most municipal water departments. My neighbors used to think I was crazy for spending so much money on filtration and purification systems. Sarah definitely thought I was crazy for it. 20 minutes after the first alert, my phone buzzed again. This time the message was different. Shelter-in-place advisory, Crescent City Emergency Management. All residents advised to remain indoors, avoid public areas, do not drink tap water under any circumstances, monitor emergency broadcasts. I walked outside to check on Maria and Jake. The morning fog was just starting to burn off, and I could see downtown Crescent City about 2 miles south. Everything looked normal from a distance. Cars moving on Highway 101, boats in the harbor, just another Tuesday on the North Coast. "Hey Maria, you got family in town?" I asked. "My sister and her kids live on K Street. Why? Might want to give them a call, make sure they're staying inside today." She tried calling, but the lines were jammed. Cell towers were overloaded with everyone trying to call everyone else. We kept working, but I had this feeling in my gut that something was seriously wrong. I've been around water systems long enough to know that municipal water treatment plants don't just suddenly discover contamination. They monitor that stuff constantly. For them to issue a boil water advisory means something went very, very wrong very quickly. Then came the third alert at 11:15. Shelter in place immediately. Do not leave your current location. Avoid all human contact. Medical emergency in progress. Military assistance requested. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with some routine water contamination. Medical emergency, military assistance. Those aren't phrases you see in normal emergency alerts. I called Maria and Jake back to the office building. "Whatever's happening in town, we're staying put until we know more." Jake had been monitoring the marine radio, trying to pick up chatter from the Coast Guard station. "Something big is going down," he said. "Coast Guard's talking about establishing a perimeter around the whole county. Never heard anything like it." The office building has security cameras covering most of the property, and a few pointed toward the highway and town. I pulled up the feeds on my computer while we tried to figure out what was happening. The highway looked normal, maybe a little more traffic than usual heading north out of town. The harbor was harder to see from our distance, but boats seemed to be moving around like any other day. Maria was getting more anxious about her sister. I should drive into town and check on them. "No," I said. "Whatever's happening, the authorities are telling people to avoid human contact. That doesn't sound like a water contamination issue anymore." "Then what does it sound like?" I didn't have an answer. I'd been reading the news lately about some new water treatment technology being tested in California. Something called AquaPure, supposed to be revolutionary. They were testing it in 7 cities across the state. I remember reading about it and thinking, if this system is so revolutionary, why test it in 7 cities at once? That's not how you roll out new technology safely. You start small, work out the bugs, then expand. Testing in 7 cities simultaneously seemed reckless, but I kept that thought to myself. No point in speculating when we didn't have facts. By noon, we still hadn't heard anything official beyond the emergency alerts. Jake had managed to pick up some radio chatter from emergency responders, but it was all in code and didn't tell us much. Maria was pacing around the office like a caged animal, worried sick about her family. That's when I decided to walk down to the harbor overlook to get a better view of town. Our property sits on a small bluff, and there's a spot near the south fence line where you can see most of downtown Crescent City and the harbor clearly. What I saw changed everything. Mrs. Patterson owned a bait and tackle shop right on the harbor. I'd been buying supplies from her for years. Nice lady, probably 70 years old, always had a kind word and a piece of candy for kids who came in with their parents. I could see her shop clearly through my binoculars. She was outside helping a customer load ice into his truck. Weekend fisherman by the look of him, probably planning to head out for some lingcod. Normal interaction, the kind I'd seen 1,000 times before. Mrs. Patterson was talking to the guy, gesturing toward his cooler. Then she stopped mid-sentence, just froze completely. Her head tilted to one side in a way that wasn't natural, like she was listening to something only she could hear. The customer noticed and said something to her, probably asking if she was okay. That's when Mrs. Patterson lunged at his throat, not pushed him or grabbed him, lunged, like an animal attacking prey. Her teeth went straight for his neck, and she bit down hard enough that I could see blood from 2 miles away. The customer screamed and fought her off, stumbling backward against his truck. Mrs. Patterson didn't stop. She came at him again, moving wrong, like her joints weren't working the way they should. The customer grabbed a fishing net from his truck bed and used it to keep her away while he jumped into the driver's seat. He managed to get the truck started and drove off, but I could see blood streaming down his neck. Mrs. Patterson stood in the parking lot, blood on her mouth, moving in these weird, jerky motions like she was trying to remember how to walk. I kept watching through the binoculars, hoping someone would come help her, thinking maybe she'd had some kind of medical episode, stroke or seizure or something. But nobody came, and Mrs. Patterson just stood there, moving wrong, looking around like she was hunting for something. Then I saw the customer's truck. He'd made it maybe 3 blocks before pulling over. I watched him get out, stumble a few steps, then collapse on the sidewalk. His body was convulsing, thrashing around like he was having the worst seizure imaginable. The convulsions lasted about 3 minutes. Then he went completely still. Then he stood up. When he stood up, something was different. The way he moved, the way he held his head. Same wrong, jerky movements I'd seen from Mrs. Patterson. He looked around the street, turned his head toward downtown, and started walking. Not normal walking, predatory walking, like he was tracking prey. That's when I understood this wasn't a medical emergency or water contamination or anything normal. I just watched Mrs. Patterson bite someone and watched that someone turn into something else entirely. I ran back to the office building. Maria and Jake were monitoring the radio, trying to get information from outside the county. "We need to secure this place right now," I said. "What did you see?" Maria asked. I told them about Mrs. Patterson and the customer, about the bite and the transformation and the way they both moved afterward. Jake thought I was losing my mind. Maria wanted to drive into town immediately to find her sister. "No," I said. "Look, I know how this sounds, but something is very wrong with people in town, and whatever it is spreads through bites. We stay here, we secure the perimeter, and we wait for more information." Jake was scanning through radio frequencies, trying to find news from other areas. "Getting reports from Portland," he said. "Something about violent incidents downtown. Seattle too. San Francisco." My blood went cold. Portland, Seattle, San Francisco. All cities that were testing the Aquapure water treatment system. All cities where something very bad was happening on the same day. "Maria, what water did you drink this morning?" "Bottled water, same as always. You know I don't trust that well water." "Jake, coffee from home, made with bottled water. Haven't had tap water in years, not since that algae bloom in 2022. I realized all three of us had avoided drinking tap water that morning. Maria because she preferred bottled water, Jake because he was paranoid about algae blooms, me because I test everything and the city water had been tasting off lately. "The people getting sick," I said. "I bet they all drank tap water this morning." We spent the next hour securing the property. The office building is concrete block construction with heavy doors and small windows. We moved supplies inside, checked the backup generators, made sure our water filtration systems were running properly. Jake found some lumber in the storage shed and started boarding up the windows. Around 2 o'clock, I went back to the harbor overlook to check on town. What I saw was chaos. People were running in the streets. Cars were crashed at intersections. I could see smoke rising from several buildings downtown. And scattered throughout the chaos were people moving wrong. People with that same jerky, predatory gait I'd seen from Mrs. Patterson and the customer. The infected, because that's what they clearly were, seemed to be chasing the normal people. Every time they caught someone, there was a struggle, screaming. Then after a few minutes the screaming would stop, and there would be another infected person moving wrong through the streets. I counted at least 20 infected people visible from my vantage point, and that was just what I could see clearly. Downtown Crescent City has about 5,000 residents on a normal day. If even 10% of them had been infected in the last few hours, we were looking at 500 of these things loose in a small area. By 4 o'clock, the infected outnumbered the normal people visible on the streets. The normal people had either fled, hidden, or been turned into more infected. The downtown area looked like a war zone, but instead of soldiers, there were predators in human bodies hunting for prey. Jake managed to pick up a Coast Guard transmission around 5 o'clock. They were establishing a quarantine zone around the entire county. Nothing in, nothing out, military enforcement. Orders were to contain whatever was happening until they could understand and respond to it. "We're trapped," Maria said. "No," I said. "We're isolated. There's a difference. Trapped means we can't get out and we're in danger. Isolated means we're protected from whatever's happening out there." But I wasn't sure I believed my own words. Our property is defendable, but it's not a fortress. If those infected things decided to come after us, we had limited options for protection. Evening brought new horrors. Through the security cameras, I could see infected wandering Highway 101. They seemed to be spreading out from town, maybe looking for new prey. Some of them were heading north in our general direction. The worst part was that they looked completely human from a distance. You couldn't tell they were infected until you saw the way they moved or got close enough to see their eyes. I noticed their eyes had gone completely black, like all the color had drained out. Maria was getting desperate about her sister and the kids. "I have to go check on them." "Maria, look at the camera feeds. Look at what's happening in town. Your sister is either safe somewhere hiding or she's already been infected. If she's safe, going into town puts both of you in danger. If she's infected, going into town gets you killed or turned into one of those things. I can't just abandon them." "You're not abandoning them. You're staying alive so you can help them later if they're still alive to be helped." Jake was more practical. "How long can we hold out here?" "I've been thinking about that all day. We've got enough food for maybe 2 weeks if we're careful. Water isn't a problem as long as our filtration systems keep working. Fuel for the generators will last about a month. After that, we're going to need to either get more supplies or find somewhere else to go." "Assuming there's anywhere else to go," Jake said. That night, we took turns on watch. I volunteered for the first shift, partly because I couldn't sleep anyway and partly because I wanted to study the infected behavior without Maria and Jake panicking. Through the security cameras, I watched infected wandering around our property perimeter. They seemed drawn to the buildings but couldn't figure out how to get inside. They would walk up to walls and doors, touch them, sometimes scratch at them, but they didn't seem capable of complex problem-solving like using tools or working together to overcome obstacles. More importantly, I noticed they seemed to avoid certain areas of the property. Specifically, they stayed away from the area around the fish ponds. At first I thought it was coincidence, but I watched for 3 hours and the pattern was consistent. They would approach to within about 50 feet of the pond area, then veer away like something was repelling them. I made a note to investigate that in the morning. If something about our pond setup was keeping the infected away, that information could be crucial for our survival. Around midnight, Jake took over the watch. I tried to sleep but kept thinking about what I'd seen. The speed of the infection, the way it spread through bites, the behavioral changes in the infected. Most disturbing was how quickly it had spread through town. This morning Crescent City was normal. Tonight it was overrun with infected predators. Whatever was in the city water supply, it had turned ordinary people into something that wasn't quite human anymore. They retained basic motor functions and some kind of hunting instinct, but they'd lost everything that made them people. Empathy, reasoning, self-preservation, all gone, replaced with an overwhelming drive to bite and spread the infection. I thought about Mrs. Patterson, who'd given my nephew candy every time his parents brought him to visit the harbor. She'd been infected for maybe 6 hours, and in that time she'd completely lost everything that made her the person I'd known for years. The thing wearing her body was just a predator now, no different from a rabid animal except it looked human. Maria woke me up at 4 in the morning for my second watch shift. Any activity, few of them wandering around, but they seem to lose interest if there's nothing to hunt. Jake thinks they might be less active in the dark. What do you think they are? I'd been wondering that all day. Best guess. Some kind of fungal or parasitic infection that affects the brain, takes over motor functions and basic instincts while destroying higher cognitive abilities. I've read about similar things in insects. Fungi that turn ants into zombies, make them climb to high places before the fungus kills them and spreads spores. You think that's what happened to the water supply? The timing is too perfect to be coincidence. New water treatment system gets tested in 7 cities. All 7 cities have outbreaks on the same day. Something went wrong with AquaPure, and now we're dealing with the consequences. The rest of my watch passed quietly. The infected seemed less active in the dark, just wandering aimlessly instead of actively hunting. But as dawn approached, they became more focused, more purposeful in their movements. By sunrise, I counted 15 infected within sight of our property. They were drawn to the buildings, probably by sound or smell, but they kept avoiding the pond area. Whatever was repelling them seemed stronger in daylight. Maria and Jake woke up as the sun was coming up. We made breakfast from our supplies, carefully rationing everything. Jake had found an old battery-powered radio and was scanning for news from outside the county. Most stations were off the air. The few that were still broadcasting were playing emergency messages on repeat. Stay indoors, avoid human contact, wait for military assistance. Nothing about what was causing the outbreak or how long it might last. Around 7 in the morning, we heard helicopters flying over, military choppers heading south toward town. Jake thought they might be bringing help, but I wasn't optimistic. If this outbreak was happening in multiple cities simultaneously, the military was probably stretched too thin to provide much help to any one location. Then Maria noticed something that made my blood run cold. "Look at camera 3, she said. Camera 3 covers the south fence line, the area closest to town. A group of infected was approaching our property, but they weren't wandering aimlessly like the others. They were moving together almost like a pack, heading directly toward our buildings. There were 8 of them. I recognized 2 faces. Tom Bradley, who owned the hardware store and had helped me install the solar panels last year, and Lisa Chen, who worked at the post office and always asked about my fish when I came in to mail orders. Now they were both infected, moving with that terrible jerky gait, their black eyes fixed on our buildings. They'd lost everything that made them human, but somehow they were coordinating their approach. As I watched them get closer, I realized that everything we thought we knew about survival was about to be tested. The pack of 8 infected reached our south fence around 8 in the morning. Tom Bradley, who used to help me fix equipment and always brought his thermos of coffee when he worked, was now leading them with those dead black eyes, scanning our property like a predator mapping territory. Lisa Chen, who remembered every customer's name and always smiled when she handed over packages, moved behind him with the same mechanical precision. I watched through the security cameras as they tested different sections of the fence. Not random testing either. They seemed to be looking for weak points, places where the chain link might give way or where they could climb over. The coordination was disturbing because it suggested they retained some problem-solving ability, just focused entirely on hunting and spreading the infection. "They're working together," Maria said, watching over my shoulder. "Yeah, I noticed that too. Whatever this infection does to the brain, it doesn't completely destroy intelligence, just redirects it." Jake was monitoring the radio, still hoping for news from outside the county. Getting some chatter from emergency responders in Eureka. Sounds like they're dealing with the same thing up there. The infected spent about an hour testing our perimeter. They found a spot where the fence was slightly lower and started climbing. Tom Bradley went first, his movements awkward but determined. The others followed, moving with that same jerky coordination. Once they were inside our property, something interesting happened. They started walking toward the main building, but as they got closer to the fish ponds, their behavior changed. They slowed down, then stopped completely. Tom Bradley turned his head toward the ponds, took a few steps in that direction, then backed away like something had startled him. "They don't like the pond area," I said. "I noticed it last night too. Something about that part of the property repels them." "What could cause that?" Maria asked. "I've been thinking about it all night. Has to be something in the water. Our whole operation runs on a closed-loop filtration system. We pull water from the well, treat it with specific chemicals to balance pH and remove contaminants, then circulate it through the ponds. Maybe something in that process creates a scent or chemical signature they can't tolerate." The infected eventually gave up on the pond area and focused on the buildings. They spent the rest of the morning trying to find ways inside, scratching at doors and windows, testing every possible entry point. But our security preparations held. The concrete block construction and boarded windows kept them out. Around noon, they lost interest and wandered off toward the highway. I think they needed active prey to maintain their focus. Without humans to hunt, they reverted to aimless wandering. But the damage was done to our group dynamics. Seeing Tom and Lisa transformed into those things hit Maria hard. She'd known both of them since she was a kid. Jake was more shaken than he wanted to admit. These weren't strangers from news reports anymore. These were people we'd shared meals with, people who'd been part of our community. "How many people in town do you think are still human?" Maria asked. I'd been doing rough calculations based on what I'd observed. "Maybe 20% if we're lucky. The infection spreads fast and it spreads through bites. In a small community like Crescent City, once it reaches critical mass, it spreads exponentially." "What about my sister and the kids?" "I don't know, Maria, but I know that going into town right now would be suicide. If they're alive, they're hiding somewhere safe. If they're not, there's nothing you can do to help them." She didn't like that answer, but she couldn't argue with the logic. We'd all seen what downtown looked like through the cameras. Even if her family was alive, finding them in that chaos would require getting past hundreds of infected, and the odds of success were virtually zero. That afternoon, I decided to study the infected behavior more systematically. I set up observation posts at different points around the property and started taking notes. How they moved, what attracted their attention, what repelled them, whether they showed any patterns or learning ability. The first thing I noticed was that they were most active during dawn and dusk hours. During midday heat, they seemed sluggish, seeking shade and moving slowly. But as the sun started going down, they became more focused and aggressive. The second thing was their reaction to water. Not just our treated pond water, but any significant water source. They would approach creeks and streams, but they wouldn't cross them unless the water was very shallow. Something about flowing water seemed to disturb them. The third observation was the most disturbing. The infected were communicating with each other somehow. Not talking, but they seemed to share information. When one of them found an interesting scent or sound, the others would focus on the same area. When one gave up on a particular approach to a building, the others would give up too. "They're learning," I told Jake and Maria during our evening meal. "Not like humans learn, but they're adapting their behavior based on experience." "That's bad news for us," Jake said. "Maybe, or maybe it's an opportunity. If they're learning, they might also develop preferences and aversions. The fact that they avoid our pond area suggests they can be repelled by the right stimuli." I spent that night's watch shift testing a theory. I filled several buckets with treated water from our pond system and placed them at different points around the property perimeter. Within an hour, infected approaching those areas started avoiding them, just like they avoided the ponds themselves. By morning, I was convinced our water treatment system was creating some kind of chemical deterrent. The question was figuring out which specific component was causing the effect. Our system uses a standard combination of filtration media, pH adjusters, and sanitizing agents. We filter out sediment and organic matter, adjust pH to optimal levels for fish health, Then add controlled amounts of chloramine and other chemicals to prevent bacterial growth. The water gets recirculated through the system multiple times, building up concentration of treatment chemicals over time. I started testing different components, placing small containers of various treatment chemicals around the property to see which ones affected infected behavior. The results were encouraging. Several of the chemicals we used routinely seemed to repel them, with chloramine being the most effective. This could be huge, I told Maria and Jake on the morning of day 3. If we can figure out exactly what's repelling them, we might be able to create safe zones anywhere there's water. How would that work? Maria asked. Portable sprinkler systems, treated water barriers, even just containers of the right chemicals placed strategically around an area. If the infection spreads through bites and the infected avoids certain chemical signatures, we could use that to protect people. Jake was skeptical. Seems too simple. If it was that easy, someone else would have figured it out by now. Maybe they have figured it out but don't have a way to communicate it. All normal communication systems are down. Emergency responders are overwhelmed. Even if someone discovered a repellent, how would they share that information? That afternoon, we had our first close call with an infected. Jake was checking the solar panel connections on the roof when one of them approached the building. This wasn't one of the pack from yesterday. This was someone new, a woman I didn't recognize, probably from outside Crescent City. She started climbing the exterior ladder to the roof before we realized she was there. Jake saw her coming and tried to get to the roof access hatch, but she was faster than expected. They ended up face to face on the roof, about 10 feet apart. "Jake, don't run," I called through the radio. "Running triggers their chase response. Move slowly toward the hatch." The infected woman tilted her head, studying Jake like she was trying to decide whether he was prey or threat. Jake started moving sideways along the roof, keeping his distance but working toward the hatch. That's when she lunged. Not the slow, awkward movement I'd seen from other infected, but a fast, coordinated attack. Jake dove sideways and she missed, but barely. He scrambled to the hatch and dropped through, slamming it shut behind him. "They're getting faster," he said when he reached the office. "That one moved like she was still human." "The infection might be evolving," I said. "Or maybe we're seeing infected who are more recently turned before the neurological damage becomes complete." That possibility was terrifying. If newly infected retained more human capabilities while still being driven by the infection's hunting instincts, they would be much more dangerous than the shambling versions we'd been observing. We spent the rest of the day reinforcing our defenses and testing more chemical deterrents. I was building a clearer picture of what worked and what didn't. Chloramine was definitely effective. Certain pH adjusters also seemed to help. But the most effective deterrent was our complete treated pond water, which suggested that the combination of chemicals was more important than any single component. Maria was getting more desperate about her family. 3 days of isolation and uncertainty were wearing on her mental state. She kept asking to attempt a rescue mission, and I kept explaining why it would be suicide. "We don't even know if they're still alive," Jake pointed out, trying to be helpful. "That's exactly why I need to find out," Maria said. The 4th day brought new challenges. A larger group of infected appeared on our property, maybe 15 or 20 of them. They were more organized than previous groups, moving in coordination and testing different approaches simultaneously. Worse, they seemed to have learned from the previous day's encounter with Jake. Instead of just wandering around the buildings, they were looking up, checking the roof, testing vertical approaches. The infection was definitely enhancing learning and adaptation capabilities. "They're getting smarter," Maria observed. "Not smarter, more experienced. They're accumulating knowledge about human behavior and defensive tactics." The group spent most of the day testing our perimeter, but they also did something new. They started placing objects against the fence and buildings. Rocks, pieces of debris, anything they could find. At first I thought they were just fidgeting, but then I realized they were building. crude ramps and platforms that would help them climb over obstacles. We need to disrupt their construction efforts, I said. If they build enough makeshift tools, they'll eventually get inside. That evening, while they were less active, Jake and I snuck out to remove the debris they'd accumulated. We stayed close to the pond area where they wouldn't approach, and we moved everything they'd gathered back to the far side of the property. The next morning, they started building again, but this time they seemed frustrated by the missing materials. They searched the area where they'd left things, made agitated movements, then started the whole process over. They have memory, I realized. They remember where they put things and expect them to be there later. Is that good or bad for us? Jake asked. Both. It means they're more capable than we thought, but it also means they can be psychologically manipulated. If we keep disrupting their efforts, we might be able to frustrate them into moving on. The strategy worked for a few days. Every night, we would sneak out and remove their accumulated materials. Every morning, they would spend hours searching for what they'd lost, then start over. Eventually, the group gave up and wandered off toward town. But by day 6, we were facing a new problem. Our food supplies were running lower than expected, and Maria was eating less, probably from stress and worry about her family. Jake was holding up better physically, but I could see the psychological strain was affecting him too. More importantly, the infected were becoming more numerous and more organized. Groups were combining into larger groups. They were developing more sophisticated approaches to breaching defenses, and they were definitely communicating information between groups somehow. I started monitoring the radio more carefully, hoping to pick up information from other survivor groups or emergency responders. Most frequencies were silent, but occasionally I'd catch fragments of transmissions. Distress calls mostly. People trapped in buildings, running out of supplies, asking for help that wasn't coming. One transmission caught my attention because it mentioned water. A group holed up in a fire station reported that the infected avoided their building after they'd flooded the surrounding area with water from their fire hoses. They didn't understand why, but they'd accidentally created a water barrier that was keeping them safe. Someone else figured out the water connection, I told Maria and Jake. Can we contact them? Maria asked. I tried, but they're not responding. Either their radio died, or they're not monitoring anymore, or something happened to them. That night, I lay awake thinking about the implications. If multiple groups were independently discovering that water repelled the infected, maybe the information would spread. Maybe survivor communities could use water barriers to create safe zones. Maybe there was hope for rebuilding some kind of civilization. But I also thought about how quickly the infected were adapting. Every day they became more organized, more capable, more dangerous. Whatever advantage we had with the water deterrent might not last forever. If they continued evolving, they might eventually overcome their aversion to our chemical barriers. The morning of day 7 brought our worst scare yet. Maria had volunteered for dawn watch, but when Jake and I woke up, she wasn't in the office. Her radio was on the desk, and the front door was standing open. She went after her family, Jake said. I checked the security cameras and found footage of her leaving around 4 in the morning. She'd taken one of our treated water containers and a backpack of supplies. The timestamp showed she'd been gone for 3 hours. We have to go after her, Jake said. We have to wait, I said. If we leave now, we're abandoning everything we've built here. If she's already been infected, going after her just gets us killed too. And if she's still alive, then she's smart enough to stay hidden until we can figure out a safe way to extract her. It was the hardest decision I'd made since the outbreak began. Maria was part of our team, our family. But going into town after her would almost certainly result in all 3 of us being killed or infected. The logical choice was to wait and hope she survived long enough for us to mount a proper rescue operation. Jake didn't like it, but he understood the mathematics of survival. 3 people had a better chance of long-term survival than 1 person trying to rescue 2 people who might already be dead. We spent the day monitoring the radio and cameras, hoping for some sign that Maria was alive. Around noon, I thought I heard her voice on the emergency frequency, but the transmission was too broken up to understand. Late that afternoon, something appeared on our security cameras that changed everything. A family was approaching our property from the north. Two adults and two children, carrying backpacks and moving carefully along the tree line. They were clearly human, clearly survivors, clearly in need of help. And they were being followed by a group of infected who were tracking them methodically, staying just out of sight but maintaining pursuit. The family was going to lead the infected directly to our property, and they had no idea they were being hunted. The family approaching our property had no idea they were being hunted. Through the security cameras, I could see them clearly. A man and woman, probably in their 30s, with two kids who looked maybe 8 and 10 years old. They were moving carefully but not nearly carefully enough. About 200 yards behind them, staying in the tree line, a pack of 7 infected was tracking their every move. "We have to warn them," Jake said, watching the camera feeds. "If we make noise, we alert the infected to our location," I said. "But if we don't do something, that family is going to die and lead the infected right to us anyway." I grabbed one of our portable radios and switched to the emergency frequency. "Survivors approaching from the north, this is Ramirez Fish Farm. You're being followed. 7 infected approximately 200 yards behind you. Do not acknowledge this transmission verbally. If you can hear me, raise your right hand." The man stopped walking and raised his right hand. "Good. Continue moving toward our buildings but stay close to the pond area on the east side. The infected avoid that section. When you reach the fence, follow it to the gate near the large concrete building. We'll let you in, but you need to move fast once we open the gate." The family adjusted their route toward the pond area. As soon as they got within 50 feet of the treated water, something remarkable happened. The infected tracking them stopped advancing. They paced back and forth at the edge of their comfort zone, clearly agitated, but they wouldn't come closer. "It's working," Jake said. "The water barrier is protecting them." I guided the family to our gate using radio instructions. When they reached the fence, I could see them clearly for the first time. The parents looked exhausted and terrified. The kids were trying to be brave but were obviously traumatized. They all had that hollow-eyed look of people who'd seen too much death. "We're going to open the gate in 3 seconds, I radioed. "Run straight to the concrete building. Don't stop for anything." Jake and I positioned ourselves to cover their approach. I had my hunting rifle. Jake had a shotgun we kept for predator control around the fish ponds. If any infected broke through the water barrier, we'd have to fight them off. The gate opened and the family ran. The kids were fast, the parents were struggling with heavy packs, but they all made it to the building without incident. The infected in the tree line watched the whole thing but never came closer than 40 feet to the pond area. Inside the safety of our office building, the family collapsed from exhaustion. The man introduced himself as David Chen, the woman was his wife Susan, and the kids were Emily and Marcus. They'd been hiding in their basement for 6 days before running out of food and water. "How did you know we were coming?" David asked. "Security cameras," I said. "We've been monitoring the whole area since the outbreak started. You picked a good route, staying away from the main roads." "We saw your fish ponds from the ridge," Susan said. "Figured if someone was running an aquaculture operation, they might have better security and supplies than residential areas." Smart reasoning. These weren't panicked refugees. They'd thought through their approach and made logical decisions about where to seek help. That suggested they might be valuable additions to our group if they decided to stay. "What's the situation in the areas you came from?" I asked. David's expression darkened. "Bad. We came down from McKinleyville. The infection spread through there in about 2 days. Government evacuation centers were overrun almost immediately. Military tried to establish safe zones, but they got overwhelmed. Any word on what's causing this?" "Rumors mostly. Something about contaminated water treatment systems. We heard it hit multiple cities simultaneously, all places that were testing some new purification technology." That confirmed what I'd suspected about Aqua Pure. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. 7 cities testing the same new system, 7 simultaneous outbreaks. Something had gone catastrophically wrong with the rollout. "How did you avoid getting infected?" Jake asked. "We have our own well," Susan said. "David's been paranoid about municipal water ever since that chemical spill in West Virginia years ago. We haven't drunk tap water in over a decade." Another family saved by water paranoia. I was starting to see a pattern. People who avoided tap water on the morning of October 15th were the ones who survived the initial infection wave. I brought them up to speed on what we'd learned about infected behavior, the water deterrent effect, and our defensive strategies. David was particularly interested in the chemical composition of our pond water. "I'm a chemistry teacher," he said. "If you've got testing equipment, I might be able to help figure out exactly what's repelling them." That was exactly what we needed. I'd been working on the problem for a week, but my expertise was in aquaculture, not analytical chemistry. David's knowledge could help us understand and optimize our water treatment system. But first, we had to deal with the immediate threat. The infected pack that had followed them was still pacing around the perimeter, clearly frustrated by their inability to reach prey they'd been tracking for hours. "They're not giving up," Emily said, watching through the window. She was the older of the 2 kids, maybe 10 years old, but she was observing the infected with scientific curiosity rather than just fear. "No," I said. "They have persistence. Once they start tracking prey, they don't easily lose interest." "Why don't they like the water?" Marcus asked. He was younger, maybe 8, but equally curious about what was happening. "We think it's the chemicals we use to treat our pond water," I explained. "Something in the mixture repels them, like insect repellent but for infected people." That evening, David and I worked on analyzing our water treatment system. He was impressed by the sophistication of our filtration and chemical balancing setup. "This is actually a pretty complex system," he said. "You're not just filtering water, you're creating a specific chemical environment optimized for fish health." "That's the goal. Salmon are sensitive to water quality. Any imbalance can stress them or make them sick. What's interesting is that you're using several chemicals that would be toxic to humans in higher concentrations. Chloramine, copper sulfate, various pH adjusters. The infected might be more sensitive to these chemicals than normal humans. Why would that be? If the infection affects the nervous system, it might also affect their sensory responses. Maybe they can smell or taste these chemicals at much lower concentrations than we can, and their brains interpret that as danger signals." We spent hours testing different chemical combinations, placing small containers around the property to see which ones most effectively repelled infected. David's analytical approach was much more systematic than my trial-and-error methods. By morning, we'd identified 3 key components that seemed most important for the deterrent effect. Chloramine was definitely crucial. Copper sulfate appeared to enhance the effect, and maintaining a specific pH range seemed to optimize both chemicals. "If we can replicate this formula with portable equipment," David said, "we could create safe zones anywhere there's a water source." But we were also running into resource problems. Our chemical supplies were designed to last months under normal usage, but creating large volumes of treated water for defensive purposes was depleting them much faster than expected. "How long before we run out of treatment chemicals?" Jake asked. "I've been tracking usage carefully. Maybe 2 weeks at current consumption rates, less if we have to create more barriers." That night, we got devastating news about Maria. Jake picked up a transmission on the emergency frequency. A group of survivors holed up in the community center reported seeing someone matching Maria's description near downtown. She'd been infected, they said, moving with a pack of other infected, hunting through the residential areas. Jake took the news hard. He blamed himself for not going after her immediately. I blamed myself for not stopping her from leaving. The truth was, we'd probably lost Maria the moment she decided to go looking for her family. The odds of survival in downtown Crescent City were essentially zero. "We can't save people who don't want to be saved," David said quietly. "She made her choice." "That doesn't make it easier," Jake replied. David was right, but Jake was right too. Losing Maria hurt, especially knowing she was still out there somewhere, transformed into one of the things hunting us. But dwelling on it wouldn't bring her back or help us protect the people we still could save. The next morning brought a new challenge. A much larger group of infected had gathered near our property. I counted at least 30 of them, more than we'd ever seen in one place. They seemed to be drawn by the presence of the Chen family, like their scent trail had attracted infected from a wider area. Worse, they were behaving differently. Instead of randomly testing our defenses, they were working together systematically. Some were building ramps and platforms. Others were testing the water barriers, trying to find spots where the chemical concentration was lower. "They're adapting to our defenses," David observed. "And they're sharing information somehow," I added. "Look how they coordinate their efforts." Susan was watching through the binoculars. "Some of them look familiar. I think they followed us from McKinleyville." If infected could track prey across dozens of miles and coordinate with other infected groups, our situation was much more precarious than I'd realized. We weren't just dealing with local threats anymore. We were potentially facing organized pursuit from infected across the entire region. That afternoon, our worst fears were confirmed. The infected found a weak spot in our water barriers. A drainage pipe that carried runoff from the pond area had a lower concentration of treatment chemicals. 3 infected managed to cross that area and reach the main building. They couldn't get inside because of our physical barriers, but their presence inside the perimeter triggered aggressive behavior from the entire group. Suddenly, 30 infected were actively testing every possible entry point simultaneously. "We need to get out of here," Susan said. "Where would we go?" Jake asked. "This is the most defensible position we've found. Anywhere else we'd be even more vulnerable." I was thinking the same thing, but I was also worried about sustainability. Our chemical supplies were dwindling, our food was running low, and the infected were becoming more organized and persistent every day. "There might be another option," David said. "Before we came here, we heard radio chatter about a group of survivors who have established a larger safe zone, somewhere along the coast, maybe 20 miles south." "What kind of safe zone?" I asked. We couldn't get details, but they mentioned something about a facility with its own power generation and water treatment. They were asking other survivor groups to join them. That was intriguing. If there was a larger, more sustainable survivor community, it might make sense to consider relocating. But it would also mean abandoning everything we'd built here and risking exposure during travel. More importantly, we'd have to verify that this other group actually existed and was legitimate. Too many survivor stories turned out to be traps set by desperate people or worse. "Can we make contact with them?" I asked. David had been monitoring multiple radio frequencies since arriving. "I've been trying, but their transmission schedule seems irregular. We might have to wait for them to broadcast again." That evening, while we waited for radio contact, Emily made an observation that changed how I thought about our situation. "The infected lady near the fence," she said. "She looks like someone I used to know." I looked where she was pointing. One of the infected testing our defenses was a woman in her 40s, wearing what used to be a nurse's uniform. "She worked at the hospital in McKinleyville," Emily continued. "She gave me a sticker when I got my vaccination last year." The implications hit me like a punch to the stomach. This woman had probably been helping people when she got infected. She might have been treating bite victims, trying to help, when the infection overwhelmed the medical system. How many of them used to be helpers? I wondered aloud. Doctors, nurses, police officers, firefighters, people who stayed behind to help others instead of fleeing. "Most of them, probably," David said. "The people who evacuated early were the ones who survived. The people who stayed to help were the ones who got infected." That meant the infected surrounding us weren't just random victims. They were largely people who'd been brave enough and selfless enough to try to help during the initial outbreak. Now their courage and compassion had been twisted into something horrible. "We're not just fighting monsters," Susan said quietly. "We're fighting the ghosts of heroes." The next day, we finally made radio contact with the Coastal Survivor Group. Their representative identified himself as Colonel Martinez, former Marine base commander. They'd established their safe zone at an abandoned Coast Guard station with natural water barriers and sustainable resources. "We've got 43 survivors," Martinez reported. "Secure perimeter, independent power, water treatment facilities, and enough supplies for long-term sustainability. We're looking for other groups to join us and help build something permanent." It sounded too good to be true, but his radio protocols were professional and his information was detailed. When I described our water deterrent discoveries, he was immediately interested. "We've been using natural water barriers," he said. "Ocean on 3 sides, river on the 4th. But we haven't been able to create portable deterrent systems. Your chemical knowledge could be crucial for expanding our defensive capabilities." "What's the security situation during travel?" I asked. "Dangerous but manageable if you plan the route carefully. We can provide coordination and support, but you'd need to make the journey on your own." David and Susan were immediately interested in relocating. Jake was reluctant to abandon our established position. I was torn between the appeal of a larger community and the risks of travel through infected territory. "We don't have to decide immediately," I said. "Let's maintain radio contact, gather more information, and see how our situation develops." But privately, I was already leaning toward evacuation. Our resources were limited, our defenses were being tested more aggressively each day, and the infected were clearly adapting to our countermeasures. That night, the infected made their most coordinated attack yet. They'd built crude ladders and platforms throughout the day, and they used them to mount simultaneous assaults on multiple entry points. Jake and I had to use firearms to drive them back, something we'd been trying to avoid because gunfire attracted more infected from the surrounding area. "Tomorrow night, there will be more of them," David said. "And the night after that, even more. They're learning and they're recruiting." "How much time do we have?" Susan asked. I looked at our supply levels, our defensive capabilities, and the increasing pressure from infected groups. "Maybe a week before our position becomes untenable, less if they continue adapting at this rate." Emily was listening to our conversation with the serious expression of a child who'd grown up too fast in the past week. "Are we going to have to leave?" she asked. "Maybe," I said, "but whatever we decide, we'll decide together and we'll make sure everyone stays safe." As I said those words, I hoped I could keep that promise. Because looking at the infected surrounding our property, watching their increasingly organized behavior, I was starting to realize that our little safe zone might not stay safe much longer. The infected were evolving, adapting, learning, and we were running out of time to stay ahead of them. The decision to attempt a rescue mission came on day 15, when we received a desperate radio transmission from the Crescent City Elementary School. A group of survivors had been trapped there for over a week, and they were running out of food and water. The transmission was weak and broken, but we could make out enough details to understand their situation was critical. 12 adults, 8 children, the voice crackled through the static. Infected outside the building, can't get to supplies. Water contaminated, food running out. Anyone listening, please help. Colonel Martinez had been coordinating with us daily about our potential evacuation to the coastal safe zone, but this transmission changed our immediate priorities. We couldn't just abandon 20 people, especially children, when we had the knowledge and equipment to potentially save them. "It's a trap," Jake said immediately. "Has to be. Nobody survives downtown for 2 weeks without getting infected." David disagreed. "The school has good security features, solid construction, limited entry points, high windows. If any building in town could keep people safe, it would be that one." I'd been studying our maps and camera feeds, trying to figure out if a rescue was even possible. The elementary school was about 3 miles southeast of our location, right in the heart of what had become infected territory. Getting there would require crossing areas where we'd observed dozens of infected during our daily surveillance. Even if they're legitimate survivors, I said, extracting 20 people from downtown would be incredibly dangerous. We'd need multiple trips, secure routes, and portable water barriers for protection. Susan was watching Emily and Marcus, who were listening to our conversation with the intense focus of children who understood their lives depended on adult decisions. "If there are kids trapped there," she said quietly, "we have to try." That's when I realized this wasn't just about rescue. It was about what kind of people we wanted to be in this new world. Were we going to become selfish survivors focused only on our own safety, or were we going to try to maintain some humanity and help others when we could? "We'll scout the route first," I decided. "Map the infected positions, identify safe zones, plan evacuation paths. If it looks feasible, we'll attempt a rescue. If not, we'll provide whatever support we can from here." The next morning, David and I conducted a reconnaissance mission while Jake stayed with Susan and the kids. We used our portable water treatment equipment to create a mobile safe zone, basically a cart with spray nozzles that could lay down a temporary chemical barrier as we moved. The journey to within visual range of the school took 4 hours and confirmed how much the situation had deteriorated since the outbreak began. Infected were everywhere, moving in loose groups of 10 to 20 individuals. They seemed to be organizing into larger communities centered around major buildings and intersections. More disturbing was their behavior. These weren't the shambling, disorganized infected from the first week. They were posting sentries, coordinating patrols, and responding to threats with tactical awareness. The infection was definitely enhancing their learning and adaptation capabilities. "They're building a society," David whispered as we observed from behind an overturned car. "Look at the patterns. Territory markers, patrol routes, resource gathering areas." He was right. The infected had established what looked like a primitive social structure. Different groups controlled different areas of town, and they seemed to respect each other's boundaries. Within each territory, infected were performing specialized tasks. Some were scavenging for materials, others were maintaining defensive positions, still others were actively hunting for human prey. The elementary school was located in the territory of a particularly large group, maybe 40 infected. They'd established a perimeter around the building but weren't actively trying to break in. Instead, they seemed to be waiting, like they knew the survivors inside would eventually have to come out. Siege tactics, I realized. They're starving them out. Through our binoculars, we could see faces in the school windows. The survivors were definitely real, definitely still human. Some appeared to be adults, others were clearly children. They looked desperate but alert, suggesting they'd managed to maintain some organization and discipline despite their circumstances. "Can we reach them?" David asked. I studied the approaches to the building. The infected had positioned themselves to cover all the obvious routes, but they'd left gaps in areas where they couldn't detect human scent or movement. If we could use our water barriers to mask our approach, we might be able to create a corridor to the building. "Maybe," I said, "but extracting 20 people would require multiple trips. That's multiple exposures to discovery and multiple opportunities for things to go wrong." We spent the rest of the day mapping infected positions and identifying potential safe zones. The route back to our farm took us past several areas where we could establish staging points for a rescue operation. That evening, we made radio contact with the school survivors. Their leader identified herself as Principal Janet Walsh, who'd been coordinating survival efforts since the outbreak began. "We've got adequate shelter and basic medical supplies," she reported. "But our water ran out yesterday and we're down to emergency food rations. Some of the younger children are getting dehydrated." "Can you hold out for another 24 hours?" I asked. "Maybe, but not much longer than that." I explained our water deterrent discovery and our plan for creating safe corridors using portable chemical barriers. Principal Walsh was skeptical but desperate enough to try anything. "What do we need to do to prepare?" she asked. "Identify your strongest adults who can help with evacuation. Organize the children into groups that can move together quickly. And be ready to move fast when we give the signal." That night, we prepared for the rescue operation. David helped me modify our water treatment equipment for maximum portability and effectiveness. Susan organized medical supplies and food for the evacuees. Jake prepared vehicles and escape routes for multiple scenarios. Emily and Marcus watched our preparations with serious expressions. They understood we were risking our lives to save strangers, and they seemed to grasp the importance of that decision. "Why are you helping people you don't know?" Marcus asked. "Because that's what humans do," I said. "We help each other. If we stop doing that, we stop being human." The rescue began at dawn on day 16. Our plan was to approach the school from the northwest, using a creek bed that would provide both concealment and a natural water source for our chemical barriers. David and I would establish a safe corridor, while Jake coordinated from our base using radio communications. The portable water treatment system worked better than expected. We were able to lay down a chemical barrier about 6 feet wide that the infected actively avoided. It required constant maintenance and used our chemical supplies quickly, but it created a genuine safe zone that we could move through infected territory. The approach to the school took 3 hours. We had to move slowly to maintain the chemical barrier and avoid alerting the infected to our presence. Several times we came within 20 feet of infected patrols, but they couldn't detect us through the chemical screen. When we reached the school perimeter, we faced our biggest challenge. The building was surrounded by infected, and they'd positioned themselves to watch all the entrances. Getting inside would require creating a distraction or finding a way to bypass their sentries entirely. That's when Principal Walsh proved why she'd kept her group alive for 2 weeks. She'd been observing the infected behavior and had identified a pattern in their patrol schedule. There was a 15-minute window each morning when the north entrance was unwatched. "We can get 6 people out during each window," she radioed, "but we'll need to make 4 trips to evacuate everyone." 4 trips meant 4 exposures to discovery, 4 opportunities for the infected to adapt to our tactics, 4 chances for everything to go wrong. But it was our only option for getting everyone out safely. The first extraction went perfectly. 6 adults made it through the chemical corridor without incident. They were dehydrated and exhausted but mobile and alert. We moved them to our first staging point, a garage about half a mile from the school where we could provide water and medical attention. The second extraction included 4 adults and 2 teenagers. This group was more nervous and less coordinated, but they made it through the corridor safely. However, during their evacuation, one of the infected sentries noticed the unusual activity and started investigating the area. "They're getting suspicious," David reported. "We need to move faster on the next trip." The third extraction was our most dangerous. 6 children and 2 adults had to traverse the corridor while infected were actively searching the area. We had to use more chemical deterrent to maintain a wider safe zone, which depleted our supplies faster than planned. Halfway through the third extraction, disaster struck. One of the children, a boy maybe 7 years old, panicked when he saw infected approaching the corridor. He broke away from the group and ran toward what he thought was a safer route. The infected immediately detected his movement and began converging on his position. David and I had to make a split-second decision between maintaining the safe corridor for the rest of the group or going after the child. I went after the boy while David held the corridor. Using our emergency chemical supply, I managed to create a bubble of protection around both of us, but it cost us most of our remaining deterrent materials. "Last extraction has to be now," I radioed to Principal Walsh. "We don't have enough chemicals for another trip." The final group included Principal Walsh, 3 adults and 2 children. They had to move through a corridor that was barely functional and under active investigation by increasingly agitated infected. But they made it, barely, just as our chemical supplies ran completely out. 20 people evacuated successfully, but we'd used all our portable deterrent equipment in the process. The journey back to our farm would have to rely on stealth and speed rather than chemical protection. That's when we discovered the infected had learned from our rescue operation. They'd been tracking our chemical signatures and following our route back toward our base. By the time we reached our staging points, infected were already moving to intercept us. They know where we're going, David realized. They're not just reacting to us anymore, they're predicting our movements. We had to split into smaller groups and take different routes back to the farm. Some evacuees went with David through the creek system. Others came with me along the coastal route. Jake guided the remaining group through inland forest paths. All three groups made it back safely, but barely. The infected had demonstrated tactical thinking and coordination that was far beyond anything we'd seen before. They were learning from each encounter and adapting their strategies in real time. Back at our farm, we faced a new crisis. 27 people in a facility designed for maybe 8. Our food supplies, already strained, would last maybe 3 days. Our water treatment capacity was overwhelmed. Most critically, our defensive perimeter wasn't designed for this many people. "We can't stay here," Principal Walsh said after assessing our situation. "This location isn't sustainable for a group this size." She was right, but evacuating 27 people to the coastal safe zone would be even more dangerous than our school rescue. We'd need vehicles, fuel, supplies, and a route through increasingly organized infected territory. That evening, Colonel Martinez contacted us with urgent news. "We've been monitoring infected movements along the coast," he reported. "They're massing for something big. Large groups converging from multiple directions. You need to evacuate your position immediately." "How large?" I asked. "Satellite imagery shows over 200 infected moving toward your general area. They'll reach you sometime tomorrow." 200 infected. Our little water barriers and defensive preparations wouldn't stop a force that size. We had maybe 12 hours to evacuate 27 people across 20 miles of hostile territory to a safe zone we'd never seen. "What about vehicles?" Jake asked. "We've got 2 trucks and my pickup," I said. "That's maybe 15 people if we pack them tight." "The rest will have to walk," Principal Walsh said. "We'll need to move in convoy formation, with the vehicles providing mobile protection." David had been working on a new approach to our chemical deterrent system. "I think I can create a mobile barrier using the trucks. Mount spray equipment on the vehicles, use them as moving safe zones." It was desperate and dangerous, but it was our only option. The infected were coming in numbers we couldn't resist, and staying meant certain death or worse for everyone. That night, while we prepared for evacuation, I had a conversation with Emily that reminded me why we were fighting so hard to survive. "Are we going to be safe at the new place?" she asked. "I hope so," I said. "But even if we're not completely safe, we'll be together. And as long as we're together, we can take care of each other. Like you took care of the people at the school." Exactly like that. As dawn approached on day 17, I realized our survival was no longer just about staying alive. It was about maintaining humanity in an inhuman world. Every person we saved, every act of courage and compassion, was a victory against the infection that was trying to destroy not just our bodies but our souls. The evacuation would be the most dangerous thing we'd attempted, but it was also the most important. Because if we could get all 27 people to safety, we'd prove that cooperation and community were still possible in this nightmare world. The infected might be evolving and adapting, but so were we. And we had something they'd lost when the infection took their humanity. We had hope. The morning of day 17 began with the distant sound of helicopters flying south toward Eureka. Military choppers, flying in formation, probably evacuating personnel from compromised positions. The sight of them disappearing over the horizon felt like watching our last connection to the old world fade away. We had maybe 6 hours before the infected swarm Colonel Martinez warned us about would reach our location. 27 people, 3 vehicles, and enough supplies to last maybe 2 days on the road. The convoy evacuation plan was our only chance, but it was also probably a suicide mission. David had worked through the night modifying our trucks with spray equipment that could deploy our remaining chemical deterrents. The system was crude but functional. Tank sprayers mounted in the truck beds, operated by hand pumps, with enough range to create a mobile safe zone around our vehicles. "How much chemical deterrent do we have left?" I asked as we loaded the last of our supplies. "Enough for maybe 4 hours of continuous operation," David said. "After that, we're relying on speed and luck." Principal Walsh had organized the evacuees into 3 groups, strongest adults and teenagers in the first truck with most of the supplies, families with younger children in the second truck with medical equipment, remaining adults and our core group in my pickup truck, which would serve as the command vehicle and rear guard. Jake was driving the lead truck. David was operating the chemical sprayer for the middle vehicle. I was driving the pickup with Susan navigating and Principal Walsh coordinating communications between groups. "Remember," I told everyone during our final briefing, "stay close to the vehicles, watch for my signals, and if anyone gets separated, head for the coast and try to reach Colonel Martinez on radio frequency 4.75. Emily and Marcus were in the middle truck with their parents. Emily had that serious expression she'd developed over the past week, the look of a child who'd grown up too fast but was determined to be brave. "Will we see you again if something happens?" she asked me before getting into the truck. "Nothing's going to happen," I said. "We're all going to make it to the safe zone together." I hoped I was telling the truth. The convoy began moving at 7 in the morning, just as the fog was lifting off the coast. Our route would take us south along Highway 101 for about 10 miles, then west on back roads toward the abandoned Coast Guard station, where Colonel Martinez had established his safe zone. The first few miles went smoothly. Highway 101 was mostly clear of infected, probably because they'd been drawn inland by the scent trails from recent human activity. Our chemical sprayers created a moving barrier that kept any scattered infected from approaching the convoy. But as we got closer to populated areas, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Groups of infected emerged from the forest and abandoned buildings, attracted by the sound of our engines and the scent of 27 humans moving together. "Contact front," Jake radioed from the lead truck. Maybe 20 infected blocking the road ahead. Through my windshield I could see them. They weren't randomly gathered. They were positioned across the highway in a deliberate formation, like they were conducting an ambush. The infection was definitely enhancing their tactical capabilities. "Deploy chemical barriers and push through," I ordered. "Don't stop for anything." David's spray system worked perfectly. The infected scattered as soon as the chemical mist hit them, clearing a path through their roadblock. But I noticed something disturbing in my rearview mirror. The infected who'd scattered were regrouping and following us, maintaining pursuit at the edge of the chemical barrier's effective range. "They're learning to track us without getting too close," Susan observed. "And they're communicating with other groups," Principal Walsh added, monitoring multiple radio frequencies. "I'm picking up some kind of signal pattern that seems to correspond with infected movements." If the infected had developed a communication system, our situation was much worse than we'd realized. They could coordinate pursuit efforts across large areas, setting up ambushes ahead of us while maintaining pressure from behind. 5 miles into the journey, we encountered our first major obstacle. A bridge over Redwood Creek had been blocked by a massive pileup of abandoned vehicles. Getting around it would require a detour through Oric, a small town that was now completely overrun with infected. "We can't go through town," Jake radioed. "I can see at least 50 infected just on the main street." "And we can't go back," I replied. watching infected groups converging on our position from multiple directions. "Colonel Martinez, this is Convoy 1. We need route guidance around Auric." Martinez's response was immediate and concerning. "Negative on Auric bypass. Infected have established major concentration there. Recommend alternate route through Forest Service roads, but be advised. Terrain is difficult and we've lost contact with other convoys using that approach." Other convoys. That meant we weren't the only group trying to reach the safe zone, and some of them weren't making it. I made the decision to attempt the forest route. It would be slower and more dangerous, but it was our only option that didn't involve fighting through hundreds of infected in urban areas. The Forest Service road was barely wide enough for our trucks and wound through dense redwood groves that blocked most sunlight. Perfect ambush terrain, but also limited visibility for infected trying to track us. 3 miles into the forest route, our worst fears were realized. Jake's radio crackled with panic. "Roadblock ahead, trees across the path. This isn't natural. Someone cut these down deliberately." Through the trees, I could see what he meant. Multiple redwoods had been felled across the road in a pattern that would force vehicles to stop. But redwoods are massive trees that require power tools to cut down. Either other survivors had created this roadblock, or the infected had somehow acquired and learned to use chainsaws. "Back up slowly," I ordered. "We'll find another route." But as Jake started reversing, infected emerged from the forest on both sides of the road. Not scattered individuals this time. Organized groups, at least 60 of them, moving with coordinated precision to surround our convoy. "It's a trap," David radioed. "They herded us here deliberately." This was tactical thinking far beyond anything we'd seen before. The infected hadn't just adapted to our behavior. They'd learned to predict and manipulate it. They'd set up a sophisticated ambush using environmental obstacles and coordinated positioning. "Chemical barriers, maximum deployment," I ordered. "Create a defensive perimeter around the convoy." Our spray systems worked, but we were burning through our chemical supplies much faster than planned. The infected maintained their encirclement but stayed just outside our barrier range, like they understood exactly how our defensive systems worked. "They're waiting for our chemicals to run out," Principal Walsh realized. She was right. The infected had learned that our deterrent systems had limited capacity. Instead of attacking immediately, they were conducting a siege, waiting for us to exhaust our defenses before moving in for the kill. "How long can we maintain the barriers?" Susan asked. David checked our supply levels. "Maybe 30 minutes at current deployment rates." 30 minutes before we'd be defenseless against 60 infected who demonstrated tactical coordination and strategic thinking. Our convoy was trapped, surrounded, and running out of options. That's when Jake made a decision that saved all our lives and cost him his own. "I'm going to ram the roadblock," he radioed. "Create a gap for the other vehicles to escape." "Negative," I responded immediately. "We'll find another way." "There is no other way, Quinn, and we both know it." Before I could stop him, Jake gunned his engine and drove straight toward the fallen trees. His truck hit the roadblock at full speed, pushing one of the smaller logs aside and creating a narrow gap just wide enough for the other vehicles to squeeze through. But the impact destroyed Jake's truck and left him trapped in the wreckage, unconscious and bleeding, right in the middle of the infected encirclement. "We have to go back for him," David radioed. "No," I said, making the hardest decision of my life. "Jake made his choice. If we go back, his sacrifice means nothing and we all die." I drove through the gap Jake had created, followed by David's truck. As we escaped the forest ambush, I watched in my rearview mirror as infected swarmed Jake's wrecked vehicle. He never regained consciousness, which was probably a mercy. Jake Morrison had been a good man who'd lost everything in the old world and found purpose in helping others survive the new one. He died as he'd lived, putting other people's safety ahead of his own. The convoy was down to 2 vehicles and 26 people, but we were through the worst terrain and approaching the coast. According to our maps, the Coast Guard station was less than 5 miles ahead. "Colonel Martinez, this is Convoy 1, I radioed. "We've taken casualties, but we're approaching your position. Request guidance for final approach." "Copy, Convoy 1. Follow coastal road south until you see our signal markers. Be advised, we're tracking infected movement in your area. Large group, maybe 200, converging on coastal zone." The same swarm he'd warned us about yesterday. They'd followed our trail and were still pursuing us, even after we'd escaped their forest ambush. The infection was driving them to incredible persistence in tracking human prey. As we reached the coastal road, I could see the abandoned Coast Guard station ahead. It was positioned on a rocky peninsula with natural water barriers on three sides and what looked like substantial defensive preparations on the landward approach. More importantly, I could see people, human people, moving with purpose and coordination, maintaining security positions and preparing to receive our convoy. "Signal markers ahead," Susan announced, pointing to a series of reflective panels positioned along the road. The final approach to the safe zone required driving through a narrow corridor between tide pools and rocky outcroppings. Excellent natural defenses, but also a potential trap if the safe zone turned out to be hostile. As we entered the corridor, armed guards emerged from concealed positions. Not infected, definitely human, but heavily armed and professionally trained. They directed our vehicles toward a secured compound where more people waited to receive us. Colonel Martinez met us at the gate, mid-50s, Marine bearing, the kind of leader who inspired confidence through competence rather than charisma. Behind him, I could see the safe zone he'd built. Solar panels, water treatment facilities, defensive positions, and housing for maybe 100 people. "Welcome to Haven Station," he said as we climbed out of our vehicles. "You made it just in time." Behind us, the infected swarm was visible on the horizon, maybe 200 of them moving together with frightening coordination, following our trail toward the coast. "They're still tracking us," I said. "We know," Martinez replied. "But they can't cross the water barriers, and we've got defensive preparations they haven't seen before." Over the next few hours, I watched Martinez's people implement defensive measures that far exceeded anything we'd developed at our farm. Water cannon systems that could deploy chemical deterrents across wide areas. Underwater barriers that prevented infected from swimming around the peninsula. Even aerial drones that could monitor infected movements and coordinate defensive responses. "How did you know to use water as a deterrent?" I asked Martinez during our debrief. "Trial and error, mostly. We lost a lot of people learning what worked and what didn't. Your chemical enhancement approach is much more sophisticated than anything we developed." David was already working with Martinez's technical team to replicate our water treatment formula. Within hours, they'd modified their defensive systems to incorporate our chemical deterrents, creating protection levels that neither group could have achieved alone. But the real revelation came when Martinez showed me their communication center. They were in regular contact with survivor groups across the western United States. Dozens of communities, some small like ours had been, others larger than Haven Station. "The infection spread fast, but it didn't get everyone," Martinez explained. "There are probably 50,000 survivors in California alone, maybe more. Small groups, isolated communities, mobile bands. The key is connecting them and sharing information. Information like our water deterrent formula. Exactly. Every breakthrough one group makes gets shared with all the others. Defensive tactics, resource management, medical treatments, safe routes between communities. We're rebuilding civilization one connection at a time." Principal Walsh was working with Martinez's education coordinator to establish schooling for the children from both communities. Emily and Marcus were already making friends with other kids who'd survived their own versions of our nightmare journey. That evening, as the infected swarm tested Haven Station's defenses and retreated after encountering our enhanced water barriers, I realized we'd achieved something remarkable. Not just survival, but community. Not just protection from the infected, but preservation of human values like cooperation, education, and mutual aid. Susan found me watching the sunset from the station's observation deck. "Do you think we'll ever get back to normal?" she asked. "No," I said, "but maybe we can build something better than normal. Something more resilient, more cooperative, more focused on what really matters." 3 weeks ago, I'd been a paranoid fish farmer obsessed with water quality and suspicious of new technology. The infection had turned my paranoia into survival skills and my knowledge into the foundation for defending human communities. The infected were still out there, still evolving, still adapting to our countermeasures. But we were evolving too. We were learning to work together, share resources, and build sustainable communities that could withstand whatever challenges the new world threw at us. Colonel Martinez had been right. We weren't just rebuilding civilization. We were improving it, taking the best parts of the old world and combining them with hard-learned lessons about cooperation, preparedness, and community resilience. Over the following days, I worked with teams from multiple survivor communities to establish a network of safe zones connected by secure travel routes. My water treatment expertise became the foundation for a defensive system that could be replicated anywhere there was access to basic chemicals and equipment. David's analytical chemistry knowledge helped optimize the deterrent formulas for different regional conditions. Principal Walsh's organizational skills became crucial for coordinating education and resource distribution across multiple communities. Even Emily and Marcus contributed, using their natural curiosity to spot patterns in infected behavior that adults missed. Their questions about why the infected avoided certain areas led to discoveries about environmental factors that enhanced our defensive capabilities. The infection had taken millions of lives and destroyed the old world, but it hadn't destroyed humanity's capacity for adaptation, cooperation, and hope. Every person we saved, every community we connected, every child we protected was a victory against the forces trying to reduce us to mere survival. 3 weeks after the world ended with a sip of contaminated water, I was part of a growing network of communities that proved human civilization could not only survive catastrophe, but emerge stronger and more united than before. The infected might have taken our old world, but we were building a new one. And this time, we were building it right. The water was supposed to save us, but it nearly destroyed us instead. In the end, we had to save ourselves. And in doing so, we discovered that our greatest strength wasn't our technology or our weapons or our defensive barriers. Our greatest strength was each other.